Welcome to this journey through one of the most horrifying chapters in American religious history, a story so disturbing that an entire community conspired to erase it from memory. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that remained buried for nearly 7 decades. Where an isolated fundamentalist community in the mountains of eastern Kentucky defied all laws of God and man, and left a legacy so shameful that survivors took their secrets to unmarked graves. It was the year 1951. America was transforming. Post-war prosperity was reshaping the nation. Television sets flickered to life in living rooms across the country. The Korean War had just begun. Cities swelled with returning veterans and their growing families. Suburbs sprawled outward from urban centers, bringing modern conveniences, highways, and the promise of the American dream. But in the remote hollows of Pike County, Kentucky, where the Appalachian mountains rose like ancient sentinels against a changing world, time moved differently. There, between mist-covered peaks and deep valleys where the sun barely penetrated for half the year, communities lived virtually isolated from the rest of America, connected only by dirt trails that became impassable rivers of mud during the endless months of rain. These were places where electricity remained a luxury, where running water was drawn from mountain springs, where the outside world seemed to exist in another dimension entirely. In one such hollow, nestled in a valley so narrow that locals called it the Cradle, a religious community of approximately 200 souls had existed for 3 generations. They called themselves the penitent brethren of the second witness. To the few outsiders who knew of their existence, they were simply the Cradle people. Their spiritual leader was a man named Ezekiel Marsh, though leader hardly captures the absolute authority he wielded over every aspect of the community's life. Marsh was 63 years old in 1951, tall and gaunt, with iron-gray hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that witnesses consistently described as black as coal mines. He wore only black wool suits regardless of the season, black boots, black wide-brimmed hats. His voice, according to the few written accounts that survive, could shift from gentle whisper to thunderous condemnation in a single breath. He had led the penitent brethren for 37 years, since taking over from his own father, Josiah Marsh, who had founded the sect in 1897 after being expelled from a mainstream Baptist congregation for what church elders called dangerous doctrinal deviations. The Marshes had built their theology on a simple, terrifying premise. The second coming was perpetually imminent, and only through absolute purity could the brethren hope to be among the chosen. Any sin, no matter how small, threatened not just the sinner, but the entire community's salvation. And in Ezekiel Marsh's theology, there was one sin more dangerous than all others: the corruption of innocence, the tainting of children's souls. The Cradle itself was both beautiful and oppressive. The valley stretched for approximately 3 miles, never wider than half a mile at its broadest point. Steep mountain walls rose on either side, covered in dense hardwood forest, oak, hickory, maple, that turned the hollow into a perpetual twilight even at midday. A creek called Sorrow Run, named according to local legend, by Cherokee who had once used the valley as a burial ground, carved through the center, its water stained tea-brown from tannins leached from fallen leaves. The community's structures clustered around a central clearing where the meeting house stood. This building dominated the landscape, a barn-like structure of rough-hewn timber, 3 stories tall with a bell tower that could be heard for miles when the wind was right. Around it, in concentric semicircles like petals around a dark flower, stood the residential cabins. 37 in total, each housing one family of the brethren. Behind the meeting house, separated by a quarter-mile of forest, stood 2 other structures that would become central to our story. The first was the children's rectory, a long, low building with small windows and a single entrance. This was where all children of the community, from ages 7 to 16, lived communally, separated from their biological families. This practice, Ezekiel Marsh preached, prevented the corruption of bloodline affection from interfering with proper spiritual development. The second structure was spoken of only in whispers, even among the brethren themselves: the correction house, a windowless stone building, no larger than a garden shed with walls 3 feet thick and a door of reinforced oak. Inside was darkness, silence, and, according to those who were forced to spend time within, something else. Something that made strong men emerge trembling, that made women pray for death rather than return. The brethren believed that Satan lived in the correction house, that he inhabited it specifically, making it the one place on earth where sinners could be brought face to face with the evil they had invited into their souls. Time spent in the correction house, Marsh taught, burned sin away, though it sometimes burned the sinner's mind in the process. Children who broke the rigid rules of the community, who spoke out of turn, who questioned doctrine, who showed affection to siblings, who were caught playing instead of working, were sent to the correction house. Most emerged changed, quieter, hollowed. Some never emerged at all. It was in the late summer of 1951, during the harvest season when every member of the community worked from dawn until full darkness, that a traveling salesman named Robert Kellerman made a wrong turn on the mountain roads and found himself descending into the Cradle. Kellerman sold agricultural equipment, plows, harnesses, hand tools. His territory covered most of eastern Kentucky, and he thought he knew every hollow and creek. But a washed-out bridge had forced him onto an unmapped logging road, and now his Ford pickup was bouncing down a steep track that seemed to lead nowhere. When he emerged into the clearing and saw the meeting house, his first thought, according to his later testimony, was relief. Where there were people, there would be directions back to a main road. His second thought, as he stepped from his truck and saw the faces that turned toward him, was that he had made a terrible mistake. The harvest work had stopped, completely. Perhaps 40 adults stood frozen in the fields, holding scythes and baskets, all facing him with identical expressions of what Kellerman described as not quite fear, not quite hostility, something harder to name. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was so absolute that Kellerman could hear the creek running 100 yards away, could hear a crow calling from the mountain ridge, could hear his own pulse in his ears. Then a door opened in the meeting house, and Ezekiel Marsh emerged. What happened next? Kellerman would recount dozens of times over the following months, to sheriffs, to state investigators, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. His story never changed. The details remained sharp, crystalline, undistorted by time or retelling. Marsh approached slowly, his black coat moving around him like living shadow despite the still air. He stopped 10 feet from Kellerman's truck. Up close, Kellerman could see that Marsh's face was a landscape of deep lines, that his hands were massive and calloused, that his eyes genuinely did seem black, no visible distinction between pupil and iris. "This is private land," Marsh said. His voice was surprisingly gentle, almost kind. "You're lost, friend." Kellerman explained about the bridge, the detour, his need for directions. Marsh listened without interruption. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll have 2 of our men escort you back to the main road. It's easy to lose your way in these mountains. Easy to end up places you were never meant to be." Something in that phrasing made Kellerman's mouth go dry. "I appreciate that," he managed. Marsh gestured. And 2 younger men, brothers from their resemblance, both wearing the same black clothing, emerged from the cluster of watchers. They climbed into Kellerman's truck without a word, one in the passenger seat, one in the bed. As Kellerman started the engine, preparing to turn around, he heard something that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A child's scream, high-pitched, pure terror, cutting through the mountain silence like a blade. It came from somewhere beyond the meeting house, from the forest behind it. The scream went on, rising and falling, and Kellerman saw Marsh's face remain completely impassive. Saw none of the watching brethren react at all. Then abruptly the scream stopped, not fading, not trailing into sobs. Just stopped. "The main road," one of the brothers in the truck said flatly. "Let's go." To understand what Robert Kellerman stumbled upon that August afternoon, we must first understand the world that created the penitent brethren, and the unique horror that fundamentalist isolation can breed when combined with absolute authority and generational trauma. Eastern Kentucky in the mid-20th century was a region of profound contradictions. On one hand, coal mining had brought industry, unions, and modern thinking to many communities. On the other hand, the very geography of the Appalachian Mountains created pockets of isolation so complete that communities could exist entirely separate from the legal, social and cultural norms of the broader United States. The Cradle was one such pocket. The valley itself was a geographic anomaly, accessible by only two routes, both treacherous. The main entrance was a narrow gap in the mountain ridge where Sorrow Run emerged, but this passage flooded regularly, becoming impassable for weeks at a time. The secondary route was the old logging road Kellerman had taken, steep, unmarked, and unknown to most county maps. This isolation was not accidental. Josiah Marsh, when he founded the Penitent Brethren in 1897, had specifically sought a place where his followers could live uncontaminated by the fallen world. He purchased the valley from a lumber company for almost nothing. The timber wasn't worth the difficulty of extraction, and brought 23 families to settle there. His theology was apocalyptic and uncompromising, drawing from Revelation, from the Old Testament prophets. From his own claimed visions, Josiah Marsh taught that America itself was Babylon, that the Protestant churches had become synagogues of Satan, and that only a remnant of true believers would survive the coming judgment. This remnant, he proclaimed, must be absolutely pure, no mixing with outsiders, no secular education, no exposure to worldly music, literature, or ideas, no frivolous speech or laughter, no physical affection between family members. Such displays invited the demon of carnality. Children were to be raised communally, their individual identities subsumed into the collective identity of the brethren, and most critically, discipline must be absolute, immediate, and severe. A child who learned to fear earthly punishment would learn to fear divine judgment. Pain was pedagogy. Suffering was salvation. When Josiah died in 1914, his son Ezekiel inherited both leadership and theology. But Ezekiel took his father's harsh doctrine and sharpened it into something darker still. Under Ezekiel's leadership, the Penitent Brethren became increasingly insular and increasingly obsessed with childhood corruption. He preached that children were born contaminated by original sin, not just marked by it, but actively possessed by demonic influence that had to be driven out through constant vigilance and correction. In his worldview, every childhood impulse was satanic. Play was idolatry. Curiosity was pride. Affection between children was a gateway to carnal sin. Laughter was mockery of God's holiness, the Brethren's. Children lived under a regime of such restrictive control that modern psychologists who have studied the few surviving accounts describe it as systematic psychological torture. Consider a typical day in the children's rectory in 1951. Children woke at 4:30 a.m. to a bell. No talking was permitted. They dressed in identical gray clothing, simple tunics for girls, simple shirts and trousers for boys. All clothing was deliberately ill-fitting and uncomfortable. Comfort, Marsh taught, bred complacency. They filed into the rectory's common room for morning prayers. These lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of kneeling on bare wooden floors while Marsh, or one of his appointed elders, preached about sin, judgment, and the torments awaiting the unfaithful. Children were required to remain perfectly still. Any movement, a shifted foot, a rubbed eye, a stifled cough, earned marks in a ledger book kept by the rectory mothers. At 6:30, they received breakfast. A thin corn mush, 1 cup per child, eaten in silence, then work. Children as young as 7 labored in the fields, tended animals, hauled water, chopped wood. The work was deliberately harsh, the quotas deliberately impossible. The point wasn't productivity. The point was breaking the will. At noon, another hour of prayer and religious instruction. No lunch. Midday meals, Marsh taught, encouraged sloth, more work until sunset. Then evening prayers, another 2 hours. Then a dinner of beans and cornbread, eaten in silence. At 8:30 p.m., the children were separated into sleeping dormitories. Girls in one long room, boys in another. They slept on wooden pallets with thin blankets, regardless of the season. The rooms were deliberately kept cold. Cold discouraged sin, Marsh believed. Cold kept children from seeking comfort in their own bodies. Rectory mothers, selected women of the Brethren who had proven their absolute loyalty, patrolled all night, watching for any sign of misconduct. A child who turned in their sleep could be accused of restlessness of spirit. A child who cried out from a nightmare could be accused of harboring devils. The punishment for any infraction was the correction house. The correction house deserves its own examination, for it was in that stone box that the true horror of the Penitent Brethren manifested. Physically, it was simple. 12 feet by 12 feet. Walls of stacked limestone mortared with mud and straw. A flagstone floor. No windows. A single door that locked from the outside with an iron bar. Inside, nothing. No furniture. No light source. Just darkness and whatever the condemned brought with them, which was only their fear. Marsh's theology held that the correction house was spiritually unique. He claimed that when he first built it in 1919, he had performed a ritual, details of which he never disclosed, that made the structure a thin place where the barrier between the material world and the demonic realm was permeable. Satan could manifest there, Marsh taught, not as a figure, but as a presence, as a voice, as a pressure against the mind. Whether this was metaphor or genuine belief is impossible to determine. What is certain is that Marsh's followers believed it absolutely. The correction house terrified the Brethren's adults as much as it did the children. Time in the correction house varied based on the severity of the sin. Minor infractions earned 6 hours. Moderate sins earned 24 hours. Serious transgressions earned 3 days. Children were placed inside without food, without water, without any light whatsoever. The darkness was so complete that survivors, and there were survivors, though fewer than there should have been, described it as solid, as having weight, as pressing against your eyes until you saw shapes that weren't there. The silence was equally absolute. The thick walls blocked all external sound. After hours alone in that darkness and silence, children began to hear things. Their own heartbeat became thunder. Their breathing became roaring wind, and sometimes they heard voices. Whether these voices were psychological breakdown, hallucination from dehydration and sensory deprivation, or something else, we cannot say. But children emerged from the correction house changed in ways that defied simple explanation. Some became catatonic. They would sit unmoving for hours, staring at nothing, responding to nothing. Others developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, trembling, hyperventilating, unable to tolerate enclosed spaces or darkness. Still others became violent, lashing out with sudden, inexplicable rage before collapsing into sobbing apologies. And some never emerged at all. This is where our story's true horror begins. According to later investigations, based on fragmentary records, testimony from survivors, and forensic evidence, at least 43 children died in the penitent Brethren community between 1919 and 1951. That's an average of more than one child per year over 3 decades. Some of these deaths were likely natural, tragic but explicable by the harsh living conditions and lack of medical care. But many were not. Many were the direct result of time in the correction house. The pattern was consistent. A child would be placed inside for a serious infraction. Hours would pass. When the door was finally opened, the child would be found dead. Sometimes they appeared to have died from dehydration or hypothermia. Sometimes from what seemed like sheer terror, their faces frozen in expressions of such profound fear that even hardened investigators, decades later, would describe the photographs as disturbing beyond words, and sometimes there was no apparent cause at all. A child would be found lying peacefully, as if asleep, with no signs of trauma, no indication of suffering, just gone. When this happened, Ezekiel Marsh had a ready explanation. The child had been claimed by the very demons they had harbored. Their sin had been so profound that Satan himself had taken them. This wasn't murder, Marsh preached. This was divine judgment. The child's death proved their corruption, and their death protected the community from contamination. The Brethren believed him. They had to believe him. To doubt would be to admit that they were complicit in something monstrous. And doubt itself was sin. So the bodies were buried in unmarked graves in a plot beyond the correction house. No ceremonies. No markers. No acknowledgement beyond a brief notation in Marsh's handwritten records. Child returned to the earth. Salvation uncertain. The families of these dead children, their biological mothers and fathers, their siblings, said nothing, did nothing. In the twisted theology of the penitent Brethren, to mourn a child judged by God was to question God's justice, and that was the greatest sin imaginable. Instead, they prayed harder. They worked harder. They watched their remaining children more vigilantly, desperately trying to prevent further contamination that might lead to more deaths. The community existed in a state of perpetual terror. Everyone knew what the correction house meant. Everyone knew that any child could be next, and everyone knew that to speak against it, to question it, to resist it in any way would mark you as the next vessel of Satan, and you would be the next one locked inside those limestone walls. This was the situation when Robert Kellerman heard that scream on August 14th, 1951. This was the powder keg he had accidentally stumbled upon, and his report to authorities would be the spark that finally detonated it. After the Brethren's guides led him back to the main road, a tense, silent journey during which Kellerman said he felt certain he wouldn't survive, he drove directly to the Pike County Sheriff's Office in Pikeville and reported what he'd seen and heard. Sheriff Thomas Hendricks was a practical man. 56 years old, he'd been sheriff for 18 years and had dealt with everything from coal mine disputes to bootleggers to domestic violence. He was not easily shocked, but something about Kellerman's story bothered him. It wasn't just the scream. Isolated communities were rough, and corporal punishment was common enough. It was the way Kellerman described the Brethren's reaction, or rather their lack of reaction, the complete absence of concern when a child's scream echoed through the valley. It wasn't like they were used to it, Kellerman told Hendricks. It was like they didn't even hear it, like it was normal as birdsong, like it was nothing. Hendricks knew about the Cradle people. Everyone in Pike County knew vaguely that some kind of religious group lived up in that valley. They appeared in Pikeville perhaps once a year to purchase necessities. Always the same 2 or 3 men, always paying cash, never staying longer than necessary. They didn't cause trouble. They kept to themselves. And in a region where people valued privacy and religious freedom, that was enough. But a child's scream that ended too abruptly, that bothered Hendricks. He told Kellerman he'd look into it. What he didn't tell Kellerman was that this wasn't the first concerning report about the Brethren. Over the years, there had been whispers. A few families had left the community, not many, but a few, and some had made vague, troubling comments about children dying, about harsh punishments, about things that didn't sit right. But these families never wanted to talk officially. They never filed complaints. They never provided details. It was as if they feared that speaking openly about what they'd experienced would somehow pull them back into that dark valley. Hendricks had always assumed it was just the usual small-town religious drama, people leaving a strict church and exaggerating their grievances. Now, he wasn't so sure. On August 16, 1951, Sheriff Hendricks, along with 2 deputies and a county social worker named Margaret Finch, drove to the Cradle. None of them were prepared for what they would find. The road into the Cradle was worse than Kellerman had described. Hendricks's official vehicle, a 1948 Chevrolet that served as the department's primary car, barely fit on the narrow track. Branches scraping both sides simultaneously, the undercarriage bottoming out on rocks and roots. It took them nearly 45 minutes to descend what couldn't have been more than 2 miles. When they emerged into the clearing, the first thing they noticed was the silence. It was approximately 2 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. In any normal farming community, there would be activity. People working, children playing, animals making noise. But the Cradle was still as a held breath. The meeting house loomed ahead, its bell tower stark against the gray sky. No smoke rose from any cabin chimney despite the chill in the air. No faces appeared at windows. Then, as with Kellerman, the door of the meeting house opened. Ezekiel Marsh emerged, flanked by 6 men. All wore black. All had the same eerily calm expressions. Hendricks stepped from the car, deliberately keeping his hand away from his holstered pistol. Margaret Finch, a practical woman in her early 40s who had seen plenty of poverty and abuse in her work, stayed close to the sheriff. The 2 deputies fanned out slightly, a practiced formation. "Mr. Marsh," Hendricks said. He knew the name from previous encounters. "I'm Sheriff Hendricks. We need to talk about your community here." Marsh stopped 10 feet away, the same distance he'd maintained with Kellerman. "Sheriff, you're outside your jurisdiction. This is private property, and we're a religious community exercising our constitutional rights to worship as we see fit." His voice was measured, calm, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath. "I understand that," Hendricks replied, "but I've received reports of a child in distress. I'm obligated to investigate any allegation of harm to a minor." "A child in distress," Marsh repeated the words as if tasting them. "Children cry, Sheriff. It's their nature. They cry when disciplined, when corrected, when taught the difference between right and wrong. That's not distress. That's education. Margaret Finch stepped forward. I'd like to see the children. All of them. Speak with them. Make sure they're being properly cared for. Marsh's black eyes fixed on her. You'd like to see our children. To speak with them. To determine if we're raising them properly, according to your worldly standards. According to the law, Finch said firmly. Kentucky law requires that children be provided with adequate food, shelter, and protection from abuse. We follow a higher law, Marsh said simply. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. From somewhere behind the meeting house, they heard it again. The sound that had driven Kellerman to report. The sound that would later haunt the nightmares of everyone present. A child screaming. But this time, they could hear words in the scream. Broken, desperate words. Please, 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 no, please, God, please. And then, like before, the scream cut off. Not fading, not trailing away. Just stopping, as if someone had sliced through a wire. Deputy Carl Mason, the younger of the two deputies, moved before Hendricks could stop him. He strode toward the path leading behind the meeting house. Marsh's men moved to intercept, but Hendricks was already in motion, his hand now on his pistol. Nobody moves. Hendricks said quietly. Carl, check it out. Margaret, you're with him. Nobody in this clearing moves a muscle until they get back. The tension was electric. Marsh's expression remained calm, but something flickered in those black eyes. Calculation, perhaps. Assessment of odds. You're making a grave mistake, Sheriff, Marsh said. There are things you don't understand. Spiritual matters that supersede temporal authority. Then you can explain them to me, Hendricks replied, after we make sure that child is all right. Deputy Mason and Margaret Finch followed the path through the forest. It was narrow, overgrown, deliberately obscured. They had to duck under low branches, step over roots that seemed positioned to trip. The trees closed in around them, blocking the already dim daylight. After about 200 yards, the path opened into a small clearing. 3 buildings stood there. The first was clearly the children's rectory, long, low, with small windows set high in the walls. The second was a smaller structure, perhaps a storage building. And the third was a stone box, windowless, ominous, even from a distance. It seemed to radiate something that made the air feel heavier, colder. 2 women, rectory mothers, they would later learn, stood near the stone building's door. Both wore gray dresses and white head coverings. Both held iron bars. They stared at the approaching deputy and social worker, with expressions that Margaret Finch would later describe as beyond fear. They looked like they'd seen damnation itself. Step away from that door, Mason ordered, his hand on his pistol. The women didn't move. I said, step away, now. One of the women, the older one, perhaps 50, with a face like weathered wood, finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. You can't go in there. It's not allowed. He's being corrected. The ritual must complete. Mason's stomach turned. There's a child in there? A boy, the woman said. Thomas, he's 10. He laughed during prayers. He must learn. Mason didn't wait for her to finish. He strode forward, grabbed the iron bars from the women's unresisting hands, and pulled. The door was heavy, the hinges rusted, but it swung open with a long creak that sounded almost like a scream itself. Darkness poured out. Actual darkness, thick and cold, and a smell. Margaret Finch had smelled death before. She'd done welfare checks on shut-ins who died alone. But this was different. This was decay and fear and human waste and something else. Something indescribable that made her gag. Mason pulled his flashlight from his belt and shone it inside. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet. But it was enough. A child sat in the center of the stone floor. A boy, thin and small even for 10 years old. He was naked. They stripped children before putting them in the correction house, one of the women would later explain, so they couldn't harm themselves with their clothing. The boy didn't react to the light. Didn't blink. Didn't move. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. His skin was corpse pale. His lips were cracked and bleeding. And he was whispering something over and over. Too quiet to make out. Mason entered the correction house. Later, he would say it took every ounce of courage he possessed to step into that darkness, and knelt beside the boy. Thomas, he said gently. Thomas, can you hear me? You're safe now. We're getting you out, the boy's whisper continued unchanged. Mason leaned closer to hear. It's here, it's here, it's here, it's watching, it's here, it's here. The boy's eyes never blinked. His gaze was fixed on something in the corner of the cell. Something that Mason, even shining his flashlight directly at the spot, couldn't see. Mason lifted Thomas. The boy weighed almost nothing, and carried him out into the gray daylight. Margaret Finch immediately wrapped the child in her coat and began checking vital signs. Pulse rapid and thready, skin cold and clammy, severely dehydrated. In shock. How long has he been in there? Finch demanded, turning on the rectory mothers with fury that surprised even herself. 2 days, the older woman said. It's the standard correction for his sin. 2 days. No food, no water, no light. Finch's voice shook with rage. This is torture. This is attempted murder. No, the woman said, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. No, this is salvation. Brother Ezekiel says. I don't care what Brother Ezekiel says. Finch clutched Thomas closer. The boy had stopped whispering, but his eyes remained fixed on something behind her, something only he could see. Deputy Mason, we need to see the rectory. Now. The rectory mothers didn't resist. In fact, they seemed almost relieved that someone was finally taking charge, making decisions they no longer had to make. They opened the rectory door. What Mason and Finch found inside would form the bulk of the evidence in the trials that followed. But describing it clinically, in terms of legal documentation and forensic reports, doesn't capture the visceral horror of that moment. The rectory was essentially a prison. The sleeping dormitories had rows of wooden pallets, each with a thin blanket stiff with dirt and use. The walls were bare stone. The floors were bare wood, stained dark in places that Finch recognized immediately as old blood. In the common room, they found the ledger book. Thick, leather-bound, filled with hundreds of pages in meticulous handwriting. Each page documented a child's name, their infractions, and their corrections. Margaret Finch flipped through with trembling hands. Sarah, age 8, smiled during sermon. 3 hours correction house. William, age 12. Spoke to his sister with affection. 6 hours correction house. Rebecca, age 9, cried after discipline. 12 hours correction house. Note, did not emerge responsive. Buried plot, 7. Joshua, age 11, questioned scripture interpretation. 24 hours correction house. Note, heart failure. Buried plot 11. Mary, age 7, sang to herself during work. 6 hours correction house. Note, found unresponsive. Buried plot 14. Page after page after page. 43 names with notations indicating death. And these were only the ones explicitly recorded. The ledger went back to 1919 and early pages were water damaged, the entries illegible. Dear God, Mason whispered. Dear God in heaven, but they weren't done. Because when they asked where the current children were, Thomas had come from a group. After all, the rectory mothers led them outside to the fields. There, working in rows under the supervision of 3 men with switches, were 31 children, 31 silent, hollow-eyed children who moved like automatons, who didn't speak, who didn't make eye contact, who flinched violently at any sudden movement. The youngest appeared to be 5 or 6. The oldest were in their mid-teens. All wore gray clothing. All had the same expression, or rather, the same lack of expression. It was as if their faces were masks, as if the children themselves had retreated somewhere deep inside where the horror couldn't reach them. Margaret Finch would later tell investigators that in 20 years of social work, she had never seen anything like it. These weren't just abused children. These were children who had been systematically broken, who had been taught that their very existence was sinful, who had learned that any expression of humanity, joy, curiosity, affection, would result in darkness, isolation, and terror. When Mason called out that they were taking the children into protective custody, not one child reacted. They simply continued working, pulling weeds with mechanical precision, as if they hadn't heard him at all. It was only when one of the supervisors moved to object that the children responded, and their response was to drop to the ground in unison, curling into fetal positions with their hands over their heads. They had been conditioned. Like Pavlov's dogs, but toward trauma instead of reward. Deputy Mason fired 3 shots into the air, the signal for Hendricks to come immediately. Within minutes, Hendricks and the other deputy arrived, leaving Marsh and his men in the clearing under guard. What followed was organized chaos. Hendricks radioed for backup, for state police, for child protective services, for medical personnel. But the Cradle was remote, and it would take hours for help to arrive. In the meantime, they had 31 traumatized children, 2 uncooperative rectory mothers, 3 hostile supervisors, and an increasingly agitated community of brethren who were beginning to emerge from their cabins. Drawn by the gunshots, Hendricks made a command decision. They would take the children to the meeting house clearing, where they could be more easily protected and monitored. The rectory mothers would come too, not under arrest, not yet, but not free to leave either. The process of moving the children was surreal. Most walked when directed, still silent, still mechanical. A few had to be carried. 2 teenage girls clung to each other, the first sign of human connection any of the children had shown. And little Thomas, wrapped in Margaret Finch's coat, remained catatonic, his eyes still seeing something that wasn't there. When they reached the clearing, Ezekiel Marsh was waiting. He hadn't moved from his spot. His men surrounded him in a protective semicircle. The brethren adults had gathered as well, perhaps 60 or 70 people, all in their somber clothing, all watching with expressions that ranged from confusion to fear to something harder to read, resignation perhaps, or recognition that the world they'd built was crumbling. Marsh surveyed the children being gathered in the clearing. His face remained impassive, but when he spoke, his voice carried a new edge. "You're removing our children. You're interfering with our religious practice. You're denying us our constitutional right to raise our children according to our faith." "Your faith," Hendricks said, his voice hard with controlled rage, "has killed 43 children. We found the records, Marsh. We found the bodies. This isn't religion. This is mass murder." For the first time, something flickered across Marsh's face. Not remorse, not guilt, but surprise that Hendricks had found the evidence so quickly. "Those children," Marsh said slowly, "were claimed by the spirits they harbored. They were contaminated. Their deaths protected the pure ones. That's not murder, Sheriff. That's spiritual warfare. That's following God's command to drive out the unclean." A murmur ran through the gathered brethren. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. A few, very few, looked horrified, as if hearing their beliefs spoken aloud had suddenly revealed their monstrosity. "You locked children in a stone box until they died of dehydration, hypothermia, and terror," Hendricks said. "You documented it. You buried them in unmarked graves, and you called it God's will." "It was God's will," Marsh insisted. His voice was rising now, taking on a preacher's cadence. "We are the last pure community. We are the remnant that will survive the judgment. These children who died were contaminated beyond saving. Their deaths were mercy. Their deaths were necessary. Would you prefer the entire community fall into damnation for the sake of a few corrupted souls?" Margaret Finch had heard enough. Still holding Thomas, she stepped toward Marsh, her face twisted with fury and grief. "That boy in my arms is 10 years old. He was locked in darkness for 2 days because he laughed, and you nearly killed him. What contamination did he harbor? What demon possessed him that was worth this?" Marsh looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and something in his expression shifted. For just a moment, doubt flickered across his features. Then it hardened into certainty again. Joy without cause is the devil's lure. The boy must learn that laughter in the presence of God is mockery. If he didn't learn, if he emerged contaminated, then his death would have been right and necessary. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. Something that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. A woman stepped forward from the gathered brethren. She was perhaps 35, thin and worn, wearing the same gray dress as the other women. But her face held something different. Determination. Anger. Years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "No, it's not right." "None of it's right." Marsh turned toward her, and the look he gave her was pure venom. "Sister Ruth, you will be silent. You will return to—" "My children are in that clearing," Ruth interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "2 of them, Peter and Grace. And I just saw you look at that boy and say, his death would have been necessary. My children could be next. Any of these children could be next. And I won't be silent anymore." Another voice joined hers, a man this time, younger, stepping out of the crowd. "She's right. My brother died in the correction house. He was 8. His sin was asking why the sky was blue. 8 years old, and you locked him in there until he stopped breathing. More voices. Slowly at first, then building like a dam breaking. My daughter. They took my son when he was 7. And he came back wrong, and then he died. I heard them screaming. Night after night. We buried them without prayers, without names. I wanted to leave. But he said we'd be damned. The babies. Oh God, what about the babies? That last comment made Hendrix's blood run cold. What babies? Ruth stepped closer, tears now streaming down her face. Infants who died. In childbirth or soon after. They weren't pure enough, Marsh said. They were born contaminated, so they weren't baptized. They weren't blessed. They were just buried, in the same plot as the others. Margaret Finch felt like she might be sick. How many? I don't know, Ruth sobbed. 20? 30? He kept those records separate. Only he knows. Marsh's facade was cracking. His voice rose to a shout. They were abominations. Infants born with defects, with marks that showed demonic influence. Would you have me baptize a devil's spawn? Would you have me welcome corruption into our community? They were babies, Ruth screamed back. They were innocent babies with cleft lips or twisted feet or birthmarks, and you murdered them. The clearing erupted. Brethren members shouting at each other, at Marsh, at the deputies. Some defending their leader with fanatical fervor, others breaking down, decades of suppressed horror finally pouring out. The children, caught in the middle, began to wail, a sound that started low and built to a chorus of pure anguish. Hendrix fired his pistol into the air again. Everyone stop now! The silence that followed was fragile, broken by sobs and whispers. Mr. Marsh, Hendrix said, his hand shaking with rage and adrenaline. You're under arrest for murder. Multiple counts, probably more than we can count. Your rectory mothers are under arrest as accomplices, and anyone in this community who participated in putting children in that stone building is going to answer for it. Marsh drew himself up to his full height. You have no authority here. This is a sovereign religious community. You cannot watch me, Hendrix said. He turned to his deputies. Cuff him. Cuff the rectory mothers. Cuff anyone who tries to interfere. The arrest of Ezekiel Marsh should have been straightforward, but nothing about the Cradle was straightforward. As the deputies moved toward him, Marsh raised his hands, not in surrender but in a gesture that stopped everyone cold. His face had transformed. The doubt, the anger, the defensiveness, all gone, replaced by something that looked like rapture. You think you've won, he said quietly. You think you've saved these children. But you've only guaranteed their damnation, and yours. He turned to face the gathered brethren. Brothers and sisters, this is the test. This is the tribulation prophesied. The world has come to destroy us, to scatter the remnant, to contaminate the pure. But we will not yield. We will not compromise. We will show them that our faith is absolute. Several of the brethren nodded, their faces setting into grim determination. Others looked uncertain, caught between their conditioned loyalty and their dawning horror at what they'd been part of. The correction house stands open, Marsh continued, his voice taking on that hypnotic preacher's cadence. Those who have failed in their duty, who have allowed contamination to spread, who have turned against the community, they know what must be done. They must purify themselves before the world taints them further. Ruth's face went pale. No, you can't mean... Sister Ruth, Marsh said, turning those black eyes on her. You have spoken against the community. You have sown discord. You have chosen the world over salvation. Will you purify yourself? Or will you face judgment unprepared? Several of Marsh's most loyal followers began moving toward Ruth. Their intent was clear. They were going to drag her to the correction house. Hendrix moved between them and Ruth, his pistol now drawn. Nobody touches her. Nobody moves toward that building. This is over, Marsh. Whatever hold you have on these people, it's done. But Marsh smiled. Actually smiled. Is it? Tell me, Sheriff, when you leave here with your prisoners and your rescued children, what happens to the rest of the community? Where will they go? What will they do? They've lived here for 3 generations. They know nothing of your world. They have no money, no education, no skills beyond farming this valley. You're not rescuing them. You're destroying them. The terrible thing was, he wasn't entirely wrong. The brethren adults were trapped by their isolation, their lack of resources, their inability to function in modern society. Many of them had never left the cradle in their entire lives. The youngest adults had never seen a television, never used a telephone, never even been to a school. That's not my problem, Hendricks said, but his voice lacked conviction. My job is to protect those children and prosecute the people responsible for their deaths. And the living? Marsh pressed. What about the families you're tearing apart? The parents who will never see their children again? The community that will collapse without its spiritual center? You think you're bringing justice, Sheriff. But you're bringing judgment on innocence. Margaret Finch had heard enough. These children are the innocents. The parents who stood by while kids were tortured don't deserve sympathy. The community that enabled mass murder doesn't deserve protection. You want to talk about judgment? Let's talk about the 43 children in those unmarked graves. Let's talk about the babies you killed. Let's talk about actual innocence, not the perverted definition you've used to terrorize your own people. Before Marsh could respond, the sound of vehicles echoed from the valley entrance. Backup was arriving. State police, more deputies, medical personnel. The professional machinery of law enforcement and child welfare was descending on the Cradle. Marsh's expression shifted one final time. The rapture faded. What replaced it was something cold and calculating. Very well, he said quietly. Take me. Take your evidence. Take the children. But know this, Sheriff Hendricks, you haven't ended anything. You've only revealed it. And revelation always costs more than silence. Over the next 6 hours, the Cradle transformed from an isolated religious community into a crime scene of staggering proportions. State police investigators arrived with forensic equipment, cameras, evidence bags. They documented everything: the rectory's interior, the correction house, the ledger books, the burial site. The burial site was perhaps the most damning evidence. Located 100 yards beyond the correction house, it was a small clearing marked by slight depressions in the earth. No crosses, no markers, nothing to indicate that children lay beneath. Forensic teams began the grim work of exhumation. What they found would take weeks to fully catalog, but preliminary examination confirmed at least 43 bodies. Many were children aged 7 to 16, but there were also smaller remains, infants, newborns. Some showed signs of malnutrition and dehydration. Others bore evidence of physical trauma, fractured bones, damaged skulls, and some, as Marsh had claimed, showed no apparent cause of death. They had simply died in that stone box, their hearts stopping from pure terror or from something science couldn't explain. Medical personnel set up a triage area to examine the surviving children. Physical examinations revealed malnutrition, dental problems, untreated injuries, and in several cases, signs of severe psychological trauma. 2 children required immediate hospitalization. Thomas, the boy rescued from the correction house, was among them. But it was the psychological evaluation that revealed the true depth of the horror. Dr. Samuel Wright, a psychiatrist from the University of Kentucky, was brought in to assess the children. His preliminary report, filed 3 days later, used language that was unusually stark for a clinical document. These children exhibit symptoms consistent with severe, prolonged psychological torture. They have been conditioned to view their own humanity, their emotions, thoughts, and natural behaviors as evil. They have learned that expression equals punishment. Many appear to have dissociative disorders. Several show signs of what we might call learned helplessness, so extreme that they seem unable to make even basic decisions without permission. Most disturbing is the complete absence of normal childhood affect. These children don't play. They don't laugh. They don't show curiosity or joy. It's as if those capacities have been burned out of them. Whether they can be recovered, whether these children can ever develop into functional adults, remains uncertain. In 30 years of psychiatric practice, I have never encountered anything comparable. This is not abuse in the conventional sense. This is systematic human experimentation in breaking the human spirit, and it was done in the name of God. As the children were being examined and processed, investigators interviewed the adult members of the Brethren. What emerged was a picture of a community that had slowly descended into collective madness over decades, normalized horror incrementally until the monstrous became mundane. Most of the adults genuinely believed they were saving their children's souls. They believed Marsh's teaching that harsh discipline was divine love, that suffering purified, that death was sometimes God's mercy. They had been taught this by their parents, who had been taught by theirs. For many, it was the only reality they had ever known, but there were also those who had known better and done nothing. Parents who had heard their children screaming from the correction house and convinced themselves it was necessary. Parents who had buried their dead children and told themselves it was God's will. Parents who had watched other children suffer and been relieved it wasn't their own, until it was. Ruth, the woman who had finally spoken up, became the investigator's most valuable witness. She had kept her own secret records, scraps of paper hidden in her cabin, dates and names of children who had died, details of punishments, fragments of Marsh's sermons that revealed his true beliefs. "I wanted to leave," she told investigators, her voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "So many times. But where would I go? I had no money. I'd never left the Cradle except once, 20 years ago, to go to Pikeville for supplies, and I was terrified the whole time." The outside world seemed enormous and hostile. And Marsh said that leaving would damn not just me, but my children, that they'd be contaminated by contact with the fallen world. "So you stayed," the investigator said gently. "So I stayed. And I watched. And I did nothing. God forgive me, I did nothing." She wasn't alone. As the days passed, more Brethren members came forward with testimonies, with buried memories, with confessions of complicity. A picture emerged of a community where everyone knew what was happening, but no one felt empowered to stop it. This raised complex questions. Were these people victims or perpetrators? Were they brainwashed or complicit? Could they be held legally responsible for crimes they genuinely believed were righteous? The legal system would struggle with these questions for years. Ezekiel Marsh himself was surprisingly cooperative once in custody. Almost eerily so. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't invoke his rights. Instead, he seemed almost eager to explain his theology, his methods, his justifications. In his initial interrogation, conducted by Sheriff Hendricks and 2 state police detectives, Marsh spoke for nearly 4 hours straight. The transcript of that interrogation is difficult to read. Not because of its graphic content, though there is that, but because of the absolute conviction in Marsh's words, his utter certainty that he had done right, his genuine belief that he was a hero, not a monster. Some excerpts. "You ask me if I feel remorse for the children who died. I feel sorrow that their contamination was so severe that they couldn't be saved. But remorse? No, I did what God commanded. I protected the pure from the impure. That's not murder. That's shepherding. The correction house was necessary because ordinary discipline wasn't sufficient for severe sin. Children are resilient. They can endure physical punishment and quickly forget the lesson. But the correction house, it taught permanent lessons. It showed them the darkness that awaits those who turn from God. Yes, some died there, but their deaths prevented countless others from falling into sin. You think I'm a cruel man. You think I enjoy causing suffering, but I dedicated my life to these people. I gave up comfort, wealth, the pleasures of the world to keep them pure. Every harsh word, every punishment, every difficult decision. I bore that burden so they wouldn't have to. I was willing to be hated if it meant they would be saved." When Hendricks asked about the babies, the infants born with deformities who were denied baptism and left to die, Marsh's response was chilling in its casualness. An infant born, twisted or marked, bears the signs of demonic influence from the womb. To baptize such a child would be to welcome a devil into the community. Better to return them to the earth quickly and pray for their souls than to risk contamination. Their mothers understood this. Some mourned, but they understood. Their mothers had no choice, Hendricks snapped. You took their babies and let them die. I made difficult decisions that they couldn't make themselves. That's leadership, Sheriff. That's what it means to bear responsibility for souls. The interrogation revealed something that investigators had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Marsh genuinely saw himself as a savior. In his mind, he wasn't committing atrocities. He was waging spiritual warfare against forces of evil that only he could perceive. Every dead child was a victory, not a tragedy. Every act of torture was an act of love. He was, in the clinical sense, delusional. But his delusion had been so forcefully imposed on his community for so long that it had become their shared reality. The trial of Ezekiel Marsh began on March 4, 1952, in the Pike County Courthouse in Pikeville. It would last 6 weeks and become one of the most sensational cases in Kentucky history. The prosecution charged Marsh with 43 counts of first-degree murder, plus additional counts of child abuse, criminal confinement, and conspiracy. They also charged 3 of the rectory mothers as accomplices. 12 other Brethren members faced lesser charges related to child endangerment and failure to report abuse. The defense strategy was straightforward: religious freedom. Marsh's lawyers, a team from Louisville who took the case partly for the publicity, argued that the First Amendment protected Marsh's right to practice his religion without government interference. They claimed that while his methods might seem harsh to outsiders, they were sincerely held religious beliefs, and prosecuting him set a dangerous precedent for state interference in religious communities. The prosecution's counter-argument was equally straightforward: the First Amendment doesn't protect murder. Religious freedom ends where children's lives begin. The trial became a media sensation. National newspapers sent reporters. Magazines like Life and Look ran photo spreads. The emerging medium of television news covered it extensively. America was horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Reporters struggled to convey the reality of what had happened in the Cradle. The facts seemed almost too extreme to be believed. A religious community that systematically tortured and killed its own children. In America, in the 1950s, it seemed like something from a different era, from a different world. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution called witness after witness. Survivors from the community who testified about the culture of fear, about the punishments they had endured or witnessed, about the children who had disappeared into the correction house and never emerged. Medical examiners testified about the exhumed remains, about broken bones that had never healed properly, about evidence of long-term starvation, about one child whose skull showed signs of repeated blunt force trauma. Psychologists testified about the psychological state of the surviving children, about trauma so severe that some children still couldn't speak months after their rescue, about one teenage girl who would only eat if given explicit permission for each bite, about another child who would wake screaming every night from nightmares about darkness that had weight, that pressed down, that suffocated. The most powerful testimony came from the children themselves. The court appointed a special advocate to help the older children testify in a way that wouldn't re-traumatize them. Only a few were able to speak at all. One was a 14-year-old girl named Martha. She had been in the community her entire life. She had lost 2 younger siblings to the correction house, and she had finally found the courage to speak. Her testimony, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper while she clutched a stuffed animal that social workers had given her, riveted the courtroom. I was 7 the first time they put me in the correction house. I had held my little brother's hand. We were walking to the field and he was scared, and I held his hand to make him feel better. Sister Helen saw us. She wrote it in the book. That night they took me. It's not just dark. It's more than dark. It's like the darkness is alive, like it touches you, like it gets inside you. You can't see anything. You can't hear anything. After a while, you can't remember anything except the dark. I was in there for 6 hours. When they let me out, I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. I just shook. For days. That was the first time. There were 5 more times after that. Different sins. Speaking without permission. Smiling. Crying. Thinking wrong thoughts. They said they could tell when you thought wrong thoughts by looking at your face. My brother went in when he was 8. He was in there for 3 days. When they opened the door, he was lying on the floor, not moving. His eyes were open, but he didn't see anything. They said he died from the demon leaving his body. But I know what killed him. The dark killed him. The fear killed him. They killed him. By the time Martha finished testifying, several jurors were crying. The judge had to call a recess. The defense's case was weaker than they had hoped. They called religious scholars to testify about the history of corporal punishment in religious communities, about the thin line between discipline and abuse, about the importance of religious freedom. They called character witnesses who testified that Marsh was devout, committed, genuinely convinced he was doing God's work, and they called Marsh himself to the stand. This was perhaps a mistake. Marsh testified for 2 days. He spoke calmly, rationally, explaining his theology in detail. He showed no remorse, no doubt, no acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong. When the prosecutor asked him directly if he felt any guilt for the 43 dead children, Marsh's response was chilling. Guilt implies wrongdoing. I did what was necessary to protect immortal souls from eternal damnation. If that cost some children their earthly lives, then that is a small price for infinite salvation. You're asking me if I regret choosing eternity over temporary existence. The answer is no. You locked a 10-year-old boy in darkness for days because he laughed, the prosecutor said. You nearly killed him. You traumatized him permanently. Was that necessary for his salvation? Joy without cause is mockery of God's seriousness. The boy needed to learn the weight of existence. Yes, it was harsh. Yes, it was difficult. But it was necessary. Soft discipline creates soft souls, and soft souls fall to temptation. And the babies? The prosecutor's voice was tight with controlled fury. The infants born with cleft lips or club feet? They needed harsh discipline too? They were marked from birth. Signs of demonic influence. To allow them to live would risk contamination of the entire community. Their deaths, quick, merciful, protected dozens of other souls. Merciful. You call abandoning a newborn baby to die of exposure merciful. More merciful than allowing it to grow into a vessel for evil. The courtroom erupted. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Several spectators had to be removed. Marsh seemed genuinely confused by the reaction. He couldn't understand why people were horrified. In his mind, he was explaining obvious truths. The community's violent response to his testimony only confirmed, in his view, that the outside world was fallen and couldn't comprehend spiritual realities. The prosecutor ended his cross-examination with a simple question. Mr. Marsh, if you were released today, would you do it all again? Marsh didn't hesitate. If God called me to lead a community again, I would follow his commands. Whatever those commands required. The closing arguments took an entire day. The defense made their case for religious freedom, for the complexity of determining where discipline ended and abuse began, for the danger of government overreach into religious matters. But the prosecution's closing was devastating in its simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lead prosecutor began. The defense would have you believe this case is about religious freedom. It is not. This case is about 43 murdered children. They would have you believe that determining abuse is complicated, that cultural and religious differences make judgment difficult. But there is nothing complicated about locking a 7-year-old child in a stone box for days without food or water. There is nothing culturally relative about infanticide. The First Amendment protects the right to believe whatever you want. It protects the right to worship as you see fit. But it does not, it cannot, protect the right to torture and kill children in the name of those beliefs. If we accept the defense's argument, we set a precedent that any atrocity can be justified by sincere religious conviction. We say that the government cannot protect its most vulnerable citizens if their abusers claim divine authority. Ezekiel Marsh killed 43 children. He admits it. He documented it. He testified proudly about it. He told you, under oath, that he would do it again. The question before you is not whether he did these things. He did. The question is whether we as a society will tolerate the murder of children when it's called salvation, whether we will accept torture when it's called correction, whether we will allow mass graves when they're called necessary sacrifice. I submit to you that we cannot, that we must not. That justice demands we hold Ezekiel Marsh accountable for every child who died screaming in darkness, for every infant denied the chance to live, for every young soul broken beyond repair. Find him guilty. All counts. And send a message that in America, in Kentucky, in this year of 1952, children's lives matter more than adults' delusions. That protection of innocence supersedes protection of religious doctrine. That murder is murder no matter what you call it. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They found Ezekiel Marsh guilty on all 43 counts of first-degree murder. They also found the 3 rectory mothers guilty of being accomplices to varying degrees. The other brethren members charged with lesser offenses received mixed verdicts, some guilty, some acquitted, reflecting the jury's struggle with distinguishing between victims and perpetrators in a community so thoroughly controlled. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Kentucky still had the death penalty in 1952, and the prosecution was seeking it for Marsh. Before the judge pronounced sentence, he allowed victim impact statements. Dozens of people spoke. Survivors from the community, relatives of the dead children, social workers who had worked with the traumatized survivors, psychologists who had evaluated them. Martha, the 14-year-old girl who had testified at trial, spoke again. She was stronger now, her voice clearer. I used to think Brother Ezekiel was like God, that he could see into our souls, that he knew when we were sinful even before we did. I was terrified of him, but now I understand. He wasn't God. He was just a man. A cruel man who used God's name to make us afraid. My brother is dead because of him. My sister still won't speak. And me? I'm trying to learn how to be normal, how to laugh without feeling guilty, how to feel happy without waiting for punishment. It's hard. Every day is hard, but I'm alive, and I'm going to stay alive. And I'm going to be more than what he tried to make me. That's how I win. By being human when he tried to make us all afraid of being human. Then Ruth spoke. The mother who had first broken ranks, who had saved others by finding her courage. I enabled him. I watched children suffer and told myself it was God's will. I am guilty too. Not by law maybe, but by conscience. I will live with that guilt until I die. But I want the court to know something. Ezekiel Marsh didn't just kill children's bodies. He killed their spirits. He killed their ability to trust, to love, to feel safe. And he killed parts of all of us. The parents who stood by. The community that enabled him. We all died a little in that valley. I don't know if what I did, speaking up, giving evidence, makes up for the years I was silent. Probably it doesn't, but it's all I can do now. Try to help the living. Try to make sure this never happens again. When it was time for Marsh to speak, he stood slowly. Even in prison clothes, handcuffed, he somehow maintained his presence. His voice was steady. I stand before you convicted of murder, but I am innocent before God. History will judge me differently than this court has. Someday, people will understand that I was trying to save souls in a world determined to damn them. I have no regrets. I have no apologies. I did what was right, and if given the chance, I would do it again. Because eternal souls matter more than temporal laws. Judge me as you will. Sentence me as you will. But know that you are punishing righteousness and protecting sin, and that judgment will come back upon you. The judge, a man named Harrison Blackwell, who had presided over the case with remarkable patience and fairness, looked at Marsh for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Marsh, in 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered anyone quite like you. You are intelligent, articulate, and completely convinced of your righteousness, and that makes you more dangerous than any criminal I've ever sentenced. A man who kills for money can be deterred. A man who kills in passion can be reformed. But a man who kills with divine certainty cannot be reached by reason, by mercy, or by justice. You murdered 43 children. You tortured dozens more. You destroyed families. You created a culture of terror so profound that its victims may never fully recover. And you did it all while believing you were holy. The prosecution has asked for the death penalty. The defense has asked for mercy. I have considered both requests carefully. But this case is not about what you deserve, Mr. Marsh. It's about what society needs. And society needs you to never harm another child. Never lead another community. Never spread your particular poison again. I sentence you to 43 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. One for each child. You will die in prison, Mr. Marsh, and perhaps in that solitude, in that isolation from the power you wielded so cruelly, you will finally understand the darkness you imposed on others. Marsh showed no reaction. He simply nodded, as if the judge had confirmed something he already knew. But the sentencing of Ezekiel Marsh wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning of a longer, more complex aftermath. The surviving children of the Cradle were placed in foster care across Kentucky. Some adapted, slowly learning to trust again, to laugh without fear, to simply be children. Others never recovered. The psychological damage was too deep, too fundamental. Several would spend years in psychiatric facilities. 2, tragically, would take their own lives as adults, unable to escape the darkness that had been burned into their souls. Martha, the brave girl who testified, became a social worker herself. She dedicated her life to helping abused children, channeling her trauma into purpose. I survived for a reason, she said in a 1985 interview. Every child I help is a victory over what Marsh tried to make me. The Cradle itself was abandoned. The cabins rotted. The meeting house collapsed in a windstorm in 1967. The correction house remained standing longer than anything else, a stone monument to horror that locals avoided. Eventually, the county had it demolished and buried the stones. Even then, people reported feeling uneasy near the site. Ezekiel Marsh lived for another 23 years in prison. He never recanted, never showed remorse. He spent his time writing religious treatises that no one would publish, preaching to fellow inmates who quickly learned to avoid him. He died of a heart attack in 1975, alone in his cell, still convinced of his righteousness. The legal implications of the case reverberated for decades. It established precedents about the limits of religious freedom, about the state's obligation to protect children even within insular religious communities. It changed how authorities approached reports of abuse in isolated groups. But perhaps most importantly, it revealed something uncomfortable about human nature, how good people can enable evil when it comes wrapped in religious certainty, how communities can normalize horror through gradual escalation, how the language of salvation can disguise the reality of murder. The story of the Cradle remains one of the darkest chapters in American religious history. It's a reminder that isolation breeds extremism, that absolute authority corrupts absolutely, and that the most dangerous monsters are often those who believe they're heroes. 43 children died in that valley. 43 souls who should have grown up, loved, laughed, lived full lives. Instead, they became cautionary tales. Warnings carved into history, but questions remain. Questions that haunt. How did an entire community participate in something so monstrous? Were they victims of Marsh's manipulation or willing accomplices? Where's the line between being brainwashed and being culpable? And how many other communities like the Cradle exist even now, hidden in remote places, practicing their own versions of systematic cruelty in God's name? To this day, if you travel to Pike County, Kentucky, locals will sometimes mention the Cradle in hushed tones. They'll tell you that on certain nights when the wind moves through that abandoned valley, you can still hear children crying. Whether that's legend or truth hardly matters. The real haunting isn't supernatural, it's the knowledge that it happened at all. That in America, in living memory, children were tortured and killed by people who thought they were doing God's work. That evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it wears black clothing and quotes scripture. Sometimes it speaks in gentle voices about salvation while building stone boxes for children to die in. If this journey through one of history's most disturbing cases has moved you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of belief, authority, and the protection of innocence, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories buried in history's shadows, waiting to be examined with the seriousness they deserve. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment. Comment below sharing your thoughts on how communities can prevent such atrocities, on the balance between religious freedom and child protection, on the responsibility we all share to speak up when we witness injustice, and most importantly, if you ever see signs of child abuse, in any community, religious or secular, report it. The children of the Cradle had no voice until it was too late. Let their tragedy remind us that protecting the vulnerable is everyone's responsibility. Until next time, remember, the darkest chapters of history are the ones we're most tempted to forget. But we remember them here, in the Untold Hour, because forgetting guarantees repetition. The past whispers warnings. Are we listening?